Welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking the time to view our presentation. We are delighted to share updates on a multi-year research initiative examining rural infrastructure and regional economic development. My name is Ryan Gibson, and I am the Liberal Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Guelph. Today, I'm joined by colleague Sean Markey from Simon Fraser University, Scott Butler at the Ontario Good Roads Association, Jay Maloney at Simon Fraser University, and Ashleigh Weeden at the University of Guelph. Over the next few moments, we will share background on this research initiative. We'll discuss the partnership that has been leading this project, major themes emerging from the research, and key lessons learned to date. This initiative is funded through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance. As you can see on the slide, we have a wonderful team with representatives from the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the Ontario Ministry of Infrastructure, the Ontario Good Roads Association, Simon Fraser University, as well as the University of Guelph. So why are we looking at rural infrastructure? Well, we know that communities of all sizes across this country are trying to balance fiscal realities. They're dealing with changing economies, changing demography. They're dealing with aging infrastructure, as well as increasing climate change pressures. We also know that investment in productivity enhancing infrastructure is among the most critical and powerful mechanisms to support long-term economic development, innovation, and community resilience. And we also know that we need evidence-based decisions regarding rural infrastructure policy and investment frameworks that are allowing communities to reach their potential and their prosperity. And we also know that rural communities are different than urban communities, and that different approaches, different policies, and different programs may be necessary to support the vibrancy of these rural places. With that in mind, we have two critical research questions that we're examining that are presented on the screen. The first is, are Ontario rural communities capable of responding to infrastructure pressures and opportunities? And second, how does that capacity affect a community's current and future long-term economic development? Within these questions, we have three broad objectives that we are striving for. First is to examine how Ontario rural communities vary in their capacity to respond to infrastructure pressures. Second, to investigate how those different capacities affect the short-term and long-term economic development. And finally, to provide recommendations to government on how to develop rural infrastructure policy, programming, and investments that will build rural capacity and support economic development and growth in the long term.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Markey. I'm with the School of Resource Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm recording this in the summer when much of the province here in British Columbia is on fire. And I'm very mindful of the traditional knowledge and worldview held by our Indigenous neighbors that has great potential to inform a more sustainable and resilient future for our rural and urban communities. In terms of our project, it's always important to ask the so what question. Why does this matter? And I think it matters for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, is that we understand and acknowledge that infrastructure is really the foundation of rural communities and economies. It's critical that we recognize more and more how important a more place-based approach to rural development is informing the future of our communities. COVID-19, like with many other issues, has exposed really critical gaps and weaknesses in our rural communities owing to decades of underinvestment. Issues like connectivity, transportation, access to rural health, affordable housing, and so on. And those gaps are deficits. They don't really even take into account the more challenging future that we're entering owing to climate change. So we're facing a very different future that requires different infrastructure solutions, entirely new ways of imagining our communities, really, when you think about it, informed by resilience, informed by sustainability, and deeply informed by a commitment to equity. We also have seen throughout this pandemic a shift that's caught tremendous amounts of news attention of people moving out of urban areas into rural locations. Those shifts and dynamics and population change take much longer to manifest themselves in terms of investment and policy catch-up than it does to people sort of looking for more green space and more affordable housing. So we'll have to also see how the change in rural demographics is shaped by the pandemic and the infrastructure and service needs that are needed going into the future as well. So a whole variety of reasons really that have, I think, been really underscoring the importance of this project. I think one of the really useful things that we've seen come out of this pandemic, a positive aspect of it is the catch-on of the discourse around moving from shovel-ready to shovel-worthy. It's been excellent to sort of see that take-up of people thinking much more critically and intensely about the type of investments that we do need, how to make them appropriately. As we approach this period and policy window of reinvestment in our rural infrastructure, we really do need to get it right. The discourse of shovel-worthy, I think, speaks to some of the lessons that we've learned in the past, particularly the 08-09 recession, where there were lots of inappropriate investments that were made, either to large industries that did not pass those benefits on to communities and workers, or to sort of knee-jerk solutions, trying to solve short-term problems by using strategies of the past. And those knee-jerk solutions that might in some way meet a particular need at a particular time, given the future that we're entering, given the challenges that rural communities face, they're simply wasted opportunities, and we can't afford that. So the take-up of a shovel-worthy mindset, the take-up of an investment mentality associated with some of the discourse and some of the policy that we're seeing around the recovery from the pandemic and moving forward into a much more challenging climate change future, I think has been really positive to hear. And in order to do that, we need really excellent evidence. I think that speaks to the importance of this project in terms of informing policy actors and decision makers about what type of investments to be made, the perspective of rural communities. We really need a strong commitment to evidence-based decision making, which is a challenge given the information gap that exists around rural and small town communities. I think we also see that knowledge gap concentrate itself as we move up the policy ladder. So this project, certainly, which has been working with a number of government and non-government actors, I think has been really emblematic of a really positive way forward to address some of those gaps. The SURF Rural Insight series was an amazing mobilization of knowledge right across the country in terms of responding to the pandemic and the pandemic impacts on rural communities. SURF's State of Rural Canada initiative, I think, has been excellent over the last number of years and again addresses critical policy gaps. And this conference, that's why we are all gathered here at this conference to sort of share information and learning. I think we need to recognize and commend our provincial and federal ministries and policy actors for their willingness to engage, for the speed with which they reached out to engage with researchers and seek information and knowledge about how to address the pandemic and ways to sort of structure programs and policies going forward. I think we have seen in a large respect a real shift to an investment mentality, which has been extraordinarily positive and good to see. So I look forward to seeing where this discourse and the policies and actual dollars start to flow to support more resilient rural communities in the future.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jay Maloney, and I've been contributing to the Building the Future project by undertaking an in-depth case study of rural green infrastructure approaches in southwestern Ontario. So what I mean when I say green infrastructure is natural or human-made elements that provide an ecological or hydrological function And this is a definition that comes out of the Ontario Provincial Policy Statement. But to say it in a little bit more plain English, what I'm really talking about is all of the natural and green space areas within and surrounding a community that provide humans with some sort of benefit. Green infrastructure is a topic that's growing rapidly, especially in the sort of sustainability planning realm, where other terms like nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure are often used. And it's coming about as a way of solving largely urban development challenges, where we've put in a lot of built infrastructure and removed natural ecosystems and natural functions from the landscape. And now we're faced with this sort of tension between natural and built environments, and realizing that we actually need green spaces to provide communities with sort of infrastructure benefits, as well as multifunctional sort of livability benefits. But rural communities have largely been left out of this conversation to date, with the vast majority of efforts focused on urban areas. But rural communities, as we've discussed, have their own unique sets of development challenges and infrastructure pressures, and stand to gain a lot from green infrastructure, as they're areas that are typically rich in sort of green space and natural environment areas that serve as the foundation for rural economies and the character of rural places. So I'm going to take just a couple minutes here to share some of the key findings that have come out of my interview process. The first of which being just how I was sort of surprised to find out how many rural communities have been engaged in the topic of green infrastructure for a number of years now, even though it hasn't been discussed with this sort of terminology, and projects have usually come about in a response to some sort of economic pressure or factor, where green infrastructure was able to be applied to solve a problem that a stakeholder was having, whether it be a rural landowner who's trying to slow erosion from farmland, or a conservation authority looking to improve the water quality in streams and ultimately the Great Lakes, or a municipality that needs to improve its stormwater management and is also making use of, say, a stormwater wetland for some improved bird habitat. So that regardless of the application, it's become clear that collaboration is key to the success of any green infrastructure initiative. When you're dealing with land use change or anything around land use regulation, that's going to impact a lot of people on the ground. And it's important that all the stakeholders involved come together to share their perspectives, their resources, and their expertise. And then finally, I've got a loaded point here at the end with a couple of policy recommendations that have come out of the interview process. As interviewees identified, there is a need for improved consistency in provincial policy to help set a standard that communities and stakeholders can follow for what the goal behind green infrastructure could be, and how they can effectively think about and plan around the natural environment to make the best use of ecosystem functions. Second is about reliable funding. Green infrastructure can be a cost-effective approach to many development challenges, but rural municipalities still might not have the funds available when a project is needed. So it's important that senior levels of government support ongoing funding to ensure that stakeholders are able to take action when they're ready and when it's needed. And then finally is about education and training, because there is still a lack of awareness and knowledge around green infrastructure, especially in rural places. Targeting knowledge mobilization through training programs, and particularly professional development for municipal staff, planners, and engineers will go a long way to making green infrastructure a mainstream practice and ensuring that all communities can make the best use of their natural services.
Hello, my name is Ashleigh Weeden. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph, and I'm here to share with you some of the results that we had from a large province-wide survey of rural leaders, as well as some of our broader research questions, trends, and topics that have come up throughout the 3 years that we've been undertaking the Building the Future project. Throughout this project, our questions have really been focused on the idea of, do rural communities have the capacity to respond to their current infrastructure pressures and opportunities, and how does that affect their ability to respond to long-term economic development opportunities and challenges? Particularly now, we're also looking at the idea of, how does this play into navigating and recovering from shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic, and how do we create virtuous cycles where we have lots of capacity to respond to current opportunities and challenges, which then enables us to kind of snowball in a positive direction to respond to future opportunities and leverage those opportunities to create better outcomes for our communities, rather than the vicious cycle of not being able to respond to the challenges in front of us today, leading to those problems sort of exploding exponentially and creating even more problems down the road. We were affected by the pandemic in terms of our data collection. We launched it at the Ontario Good Roads Association meeting in 2020, late February, and we all know what happened very shortly after that, which is that the COVID-19 pandemic was declared. However, we had a tremendously successful response to the relaunch of the survey, which we conducted throughout June through to September of 2020. We also have been conducting a number of workshops with OGRA members throughout their conferences since 2018, collecting data on additional small vignettes and case studies, which are informing Melissa Visser's work, which you'll hear from in a different session, and Jay Maloney's work, which you'll also hear as part of this presentation. We've been tremendously well supported with outreach through our partners like Good Roads Association, the Rural Ontario Municipalities Association, the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus, Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus, Eastern Ontario Regional Network, the Association of Municipal Clerks and Treasurers of Ontario, and the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. We were able to collect 265 completed surveys, which represented 237 communities with about equal representation across all 4 quadrants of Ontario Good Roads Association membership categories. Of those, the majority identified as staff, with a very strong representation from elected decision makers as well. And we separated this out a bit because we wanted to see if those respondents had different answers depending on their role. The majority of our respondents came from lower tier municipalities, communities with a population density of under 50 people per square kilometer and a total population of under 15,000. We have a wealth of data that we're still digging through right now and putting towards publications and reports that we will share with you as soon as it's available. We have over 122 variables of rich qualitative and quantitative responses. Most people feel like asset management planning is working for them. They are aware of what their current infrastructure needs and deficits are. They're planning for their future, and they believe they have the decision making capacity and the information they need in order to make good decisions about their infrastructure. Further, almost everyone believes that infrastructure is connected to community well-being and economic development. However, the way we make that link in tangible ways gets to be a bit fuzzy, particularly when we start talking about infrastructures beyond roads and bridges, whether that's technology, green infrastructure change, social infrastructure, or other economic supports in the community. Some of the notable things that we heard from participants included this idea that lottery style funding doesn't work. It feels political, it feels competitive, and it kind of goes against all of these values that we're supposed to be encouraging in terms of rural and regional collaboration and cooperation. Favoring those joint initiatives is also more challenging in a rural context where you may not actually work all that closely by virtue of the geographic distance between you and your neighboring community. Perhaps the most standout quote that came to me from some of our responses was that the need for funding to be consistent and sustainable is such a priority that one of our respondents said that they would take $0 on a consistent basis if that's what it took. Planning long-term with fluctuating revenue just does not work for these communities. And finally, we really need to start looking at the idea of how decisions in one portfolio affect another area of rural economic development and how that ends up affecting rural community leaders. So what happens at the provincial and federal level has implications for how rural municipalities make decisions about their own future. And often these communities feel a little bit at the whims of what other orders of governments decide. The major themes that we heard was that asset management planning is useful and that rural communities can and want to undertake this work if they have the adequate and appropriate supports in order to do so. Those rural communities have different needs, not only from their urban counterparts, as well as among and between each other. You know, the common surf catchphrase of if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community holds true. It remains challenging for municipal leaders to really operationalize that link between infrastructure planning and economic development in concrete ways, other than just by saying that there is a link. And so we really need to start expanding our ideas of traditional asset management planning to include links to economic and social well-being. We need to also find ways to support rural communities in terms of working with regional partners, because it's a thing that they want to do and yet also find challenging. And they're looking for ways to do this in more creative, ongoing, and sustainable processes. Finally, rural communities need a place-based, holistic, and transparent approach to policy investment across all of the orders of government and all of the bodies that they deal with. Dealing with different processes at the provincial level versus the federal level versus your regional council versus any other body that you might be involved in creates excessive barriers to entry and capacity for rural communities, and often makes things opaque. And so it's not clear how decisions are made, how one accesses funding, and how one moves forward. It's important that we also look at ways that we collect this evidence to address the gaps and barriers that are being identified not only by partners like the Ontario Good Roads Association, but by the rural communities that participated in our survey and others. When we look at the deficit that the OGRA has calculated for roads and bridges being in the $34.7 billion range, and we compare that to what the Auditor General in 2016 said would be $40 to $50 billion to build the required fiber optic infrastructure across Canada to connect Canadians to scalable broadband. And then we layer that on top of what we know is a looming climate threat and climate crisis and the green infrastructure that will be required to overcome that. It's important that we learn about the context for these deficits in order to support policy change and leadership across all communities as we look forward towards increasingly uncertain futures. It's been an absolute delight and really important to the success of this project and what we hope will be valuable policy recommendations when we finish over the next year. By working with partners like OGRA, SURF, the University of Guelph, and OMAFRA, particularly through this project, to develop community-engaged research that supports evidence-informed policy and make sure that rural communities have what they need in order to successfully link their infrastructure management to their current and ongoing economic development needs. We want to hear from you, and we're looking forward to a great discussion after you've watched all of the videos for this breakout session. What were you most surprised about in terms of what we've talked about today in terms of this project? What are you most curious about, and what are you most worried about? And most importantly, what are you finding in your work, and how do we talk to each other to make sure that we're getting that great evidence into the right hands as we move forward? Please also reach out to learn more about the project at www.ruraldev.ca or contact Ryan or myself to learn more. We'd love to hear from you and share more about the work that we're doing. And please stay tuned to that research website over the next coming months, as we'll be publishing more information there about our analysis of the survey and some finishing vignettes from some of our wonderful master students who have been working on this project and are finishing. So congratulations to Jay and Melissa. Thank you all for participating and listening, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you very much.